I co-created with others a campaign called Letters to the Earth, which I might talk more about, but we'll also touch on tomorrow, which has invited the participation of people around the world to speak up for what matters to them in response to the emergency and to share their stories of place and what's in their hearts for the changes that they wish to see. And there's been lots I've done with that. And in fact, both Farhana and Galahad have written a letter to the earth, so it's actually really lovely to be up here with you both, because that work has taken me to develop workshop programs and educational programs to find creative ways for people to express themselves and to find the courage to take action.
Thank you, and thank you for stepping in so last minute as well, Kay. All the rich work that you've done. It's a real joy to have you here on the stage. Galahad, your story.
Hello, I'm Galahad. I'm a cobbler, and just want to acknowledge what we've just heard. We're all terrified coming up here and following that extraordinary mind bend that we just had. I also had a dose of that yesterday in London from Zach, so I feel like I've just had sort of my second dose of plant medicine. So forgive me if I just sort of start dribbling and talking a bunch of cobblers. I am a cobbler. I come from a long line of cobblers, and actually, you know, the meaning of talking a bunch of cobblers comes from Cockney rhyming slang, which is, does anyone know it? This is a good trivia question. A cobbler's awl is the tool that cobblers use to make holes in leather, and awl rhymes with balls. So when you're talking just a bunch of cobblers, you're talking a bunch of bollocks. So forgive me in advance, I am a cobbler. And even worse, I'm a hypocrite cobbler because I'm a barefoot cobbler. I basically go around trying to persuade the world that shoes are bad for you. So it's the definition of a hypocrite, I think. So anyway, really lovely to be here and join the connection party. I'm the least qualified person on this panel, as you can probably imagine by now, so anyway, happy to dribble in the corner.
We're so happy to have you here. Thank you, Galahad. Farhana, I'd love to start by asking you to perhaps reflect on what is the dominating narrative that you see around the climate and ecological crisis from your standpoint as being a lawyer, like the kind of official story, and how might you like to see that being shifted and changed over the next years?
That's a good question. I guess the main narrative has been, we've got these polluting gases, but we can control them through technology or by changing the markets system by having carbon taxes or having permits. And we may not have the solutions yet, but we'll figure them out. Maybe deep storage of carbon, or we'll use those sort of tools. But this is a controllable problem, which can be done discreetly. And I guess for many of us, that was a paradigm even that I subscribed to, early on, which was 30 plus years ago, when greenhouse gas emissions weren't as pervasive and as huge as they are now. And we had in mind a precedent called the Montreal Protocol, which regulated ozone. So that treaty had been very successful, and so actually the narrative of the scientists, you've got to get fossil fuel emissions mainly, which were the main causes of greenhouse gases then, under control, was very much fed into this idea that we would use levers, market levers, technology to control these gases. And actually what we didn't understand and didn't connect to, and regrettably are now making more different ways, is that this is a very systemic problem, and these aren't just sort of gases that you can sort of phase out neatly, but they're embedded in everything from food to fashion to clothes to energy systems, and in buildings. Like every single aspect, every single part of human life is touched by and part of the carbon cycle. And so just isolating the sort of carbon molecules isn't the solution. And I guess what we've also really fundamentally, myself included, been on this journey, is it's really an issue of justice. Climate change is an issue of systemic injustice, where some kinds of people, some kinds of geographies, some countries and some people consume far more than others, and actually that is a system-wide problem multiplied and going through all of the supply chains. Basically, the figures probably very well in this room of 10% of the top 10% of the world, elite. And we're included in that, actually, in this country. All of us probably are, actually emit 50% of the world's emissions. And so that, and the bottom 50% likewise emit about 10%. So there's extraordinary disparities in who emits. This is the biggest common problem for humanity facing us, but actually everyone is impacted very differently and everyone contributes very differently. So the journey that I'm on is very much part of making sure that we now start from a position of seeing the unfairness in the system, of taking forward solutions that are just. And also, if I can be frank and tying in with a little bit with the other talk, this isn't about victims demanding some kind of being trapped in a victim mentality. I mean, I'll be really honest, that was a real tour de force, but it was very provocative, very informative in some parts, but also hugely, I think, misjudged and misinformative, and lacking in, I think, the kinds of understanding that I would wish the people in this community to understand. So I think saying that demand for justice is part of being trapped in the victim paradigm is really insulting. People are demanding to be seen. They're demanding the rights of their ecosystems to be seen. That's actually what they're fighting for. That's what the 1.5 goal is all about, which you all know, that we have been fighting for as small islands and vulnerable communities have been fighting for that goal since 2007, which is, and we've only now got it enshrined in the Paris Agreement, and now we're being told it's too late. Too late for whom and for what? It's too late for those who don't want to change. So I really feel that the narrative that has to shift and the stories that need to be heard and be seen are those who are being put forward by those groups, those peoples, those ecosystems who have no voice or who have less voice. And that's the shift that really needs to happen. And this switch away from let's defer action, let's wait for technology fixes, let's wait for the market to fix it, let's wait for, some jam tomorrow, as it were, is too much. And we have to really act on that understanding that actually it's actually a few hundred years worth of emissions by a handful of companies and countries. And that's, I guess, my other, this isn't, for me, and this is, you can all have your, this isn't about us, going to the 13th dimension and plugging into the multiverse right now. This is actually holding accountable some very powerful forces, some very powerful vested interests who are tipping our planet over the edge. And I don't believe that we're a parasite that the Earth is trying to get rid of by having a fever. So you can believe that if you want to. It's everyone, and this is the space in which we can discuss that. But I feel like actually we're here as a tribe of people who are connected and feeling very similar things. But our theories of change sometimes and the stories that we're telling ourselves or hearing are very different, and they lead to very different conclusions. So it's better to surface them than to hide behind them or not discuss them very openly. So thank you for having this panel, actually continuing with it and giving me the chance to at least say what I felt after that talk, which is, was part inspiration but also very provocative, and I'm not sure it would stand up to scientific scrutiny, which is in the end where I found my grounding as well as the soil.
One of the aspects of the dominating carbon narrative is I feel that it shifts a lot of emphasis on the word mitigation and reduction, and that for me is a narrative that I find is kind of strangling our ability to embrace. I hate when people say that this is an opportunity, because it's not. It's devastating, but to also see how addressing the ecological and climate and social justice crises isn't about mitigating a more fucked up future. It's about carving out pathways of joy and liberation, and co-creating worlds which are wholly diverse and like many different cultures. And I think, as we're talking about stories and people say we need a new climate narrative, it's like I don't think it's possible, or we want one story. I think we want to be listening and hearing and responding to many, like a multiverse of stories, essentially. Kay, with your involvement in Extinction Rebellion, which was, I felt like kind of rising up against a very monotonous narrative that we were listening to, what were the stories, or what was the story that kind of enthralled you to join the movement, and like what were the stories that you left from the movement?
I think it was that anger that I spoke to earlier that drew me towards it, because I was just so grateful that there were people that were ready to rise up or do something and declare rebellion. Oh my God, that's huge. It was nerve-wracking, to think, is this going to work? How many people are going to show up? I think, was it like 100 to I can't remember the exact number on the declaration day in that October 2018. But it felt really potent and fertile, the ground of that. And there are lots of flaws and conversations we can have about Extinction Rebellion, which I won't, maybe Farhana you'd like to go into, but for now, just for me, it's what lasts out of that story of exile, which still lives. There is a rebellion happening in April. For me, it's about the community and the relationships that were born out of that, and it was an initiatory process for many. You used that word the other day, and I really do believe that. I mean, for me, I experienced that, and I know many did, and I think that what was surprising was the initiation into great feeling and to great capacity of love and grief, and the grief was really welcome in that space, and I didn't even know I was really feeling grief, but all of a sudden the tap was opened, and it was normalized to speak of our love for the earth and for nature, and the sorrow that we feel in the knowledge that we've destroyed it, or we are destroying it, and the impact of that on ourselves and others, not just here in the UK but globally. But that I think we're still in an initiatory story and process, actually, and I speak for myself. I'm still on a journey of discovering what is my pathway through this. And I think that is something that I feel that many are in. I think we're in a threshold between old and new, between stories, and it's difficult to navigate that and to know how to find ourselves. And I think that's the thing, actually, to be undone by it. I think this is a time of undoing of all that we thought that we were, and so that we can locate something that might guide us, or we might find something in us that we didn't know was there before, and that speaks to soul purpose that Zach was speaking to, but also great courage that it takes to step into that. And part of my story has been a total, I found myself by accident in many of the spaces I've been in, and many of the coordinating roles or the movement building roles I found myself in. I didn't ever imagine I would. I always thought I was on the treadmill to be a really successful, famous theatre director, and it hasn't yet happened. Maybe it will never happen. But my point being that I've had a personal revolution of my own story, and I think that is actually something that we're all invited into in these times. And that's something that I think part of my role is facilitating that in others or for others.
Thank you. Could you put your hands up if you were involved in Extinction Rebellion? See how many. Cool, thank you. I felt that hearing you speak, Kay, I was remembering all the incredible branding and messaging that went along with Extinction Rebellion. I remember seeing the first posters and being super excited about it. They were building an incredible brand with an incredible strong narrative. But then I also remember reading the narratives in the mainstream media about the about Extinction Rebellion, and I felt as though there was one narrative that was being represented and through those channels, and I felt like it kind of dismantled so much of like the beauty and complexity of the experiences that I was having there, and then reading in the news the reflection of it felt like such an injustice, because I spoke to so many people who were having huge, greatly diverse experiences and paths, who were building and putting everything into that movement, and it felt really really disappointing. Can you reflect on, perhaps, Farhana, what it was about the movement that led to the dismantling of it in the media?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think at the very beginning, XR was welcomed or seen as a novelty or as a corrective. It definitely was by the mainstream environmental movements. Actually, they said, we can't join you, but we're really happy that you're doing it. Thank you. Broadly speaking, we built all these alliances behind the scenes, and I think the media also understood. This was just after, 2 years after Paris. We were still in the UK here, nowhere near enacting what we call the net zero by 2050 target, which is the pathway for 1.5. So Paris had required an adjustment for parties, the countries that signed up to it, to do that, and the government had just done nothing. They'd literally done nothing. They were taken to court, and they were lots of protests, and they said, no, we're not going to do anything. So there was a huge amount of inertia, and I think the media was, broadly speaking, on side for that. And I think over time, as a result of then seeing the disruptive power, and also this much deeper shift in people thinking, I can do something, I can take to the streets, I can challenge my church, my school, my hospital, my place of work to do more, I can ask pesky questions. I think that's what sort of spooked the establishment and spooked the media, which is hostile and right-wing in this country. It is protecting elite and vested interests, and that is absolutely the case, and they turned on XR. So they turned on all of the people who were part of it. They tried to make them into eco-terrorists and lefties and the great unwashed and hippies. So, this full spectrum of insults, from mildly eccentric hippie people to eco-terrorist label, which is there now, was applied because it succeeded. XR succeeded in really spooking out and being a challenge to the existing order. And it still is. The energy that has come, for many of us, to understand that we are not powerless, that if we act together and we take action together, including on the streets, in our workplaces, creatively to imagine a different world, that is really powerful. And that is the reason why more and more laws are being enacted in this country, and more of the people who are going, very brave people. Whatever we disagreed about tactics is irrelevant compared with the fact that many hundreds of activists are still going through the legal system, and now their rights to even say why they took that action is being absolutely silenced, and they're being diminished. So a great deal of power now is being used to suppress, exclude, further marginalise, cut off resources from all kinds of rebelling, and that's a good sign that it's working.
Yeah. Thank you. And Galahad, thinking about the brand of Extinction Rebellion and the powerful messaging, I feel that Viva Barefoot's done that in a really incredible way to build a brand which is based on, it feels as a consumer like a bridging between the environmental health and then human health. And I'm interested to know from your experience, what do you feel is like the most powerful narrative through the brand that people are most relating to? Do you see it as being predominantly about, the health of being closer to the ground and the health of the feet? Or is it more on the side of how the shoes are made and the environmental impact of the supply chain, which is I believe mostly beneficial?
Good question. We live in an industry and in a world of some of the greatest storytelling companies the world's ever known, some of the most powerful brands that have created these incredible stories, but they've also created an unbelievable system that is one of the most polluting, terrible industries in the world. 24 billion pairs of shoes get made every year. nearly all of them quite damaging to human health in one way or another, that literally disconnect us from nature, disconnect us from the way our body moves naturally, in extremely toxic, long supply chains, with everything from versions of slave labour, lots of heavy metals used in the tanning of leathers, lots and lots of oil-based plastics and foams and you name it. It's a terrible, terrible industry, and yet, you know, obviously the stories that surround it, and not just, let's say, the basketball and superhero stories, but now the greenwashing and even the sort of net zero stories that surround it are just kind of making something that is fundamentally wrong maybe a little bit righter, rather than philosophically starting by doing the right thing. And I think, you know, slowly there is a rebel alliance that is spearheaded by things like Extinction Rebellion, that I feel like we in many ways are in the slipstream of just people that realise that the system is broken, that this disconnection from nature, and literally with shoes, you are, you know, as Zach was talking about, you know, we're all connected by 2 feet on one earth, and this amazing electrical energy and field that the world encompasses. And, you know, I won't open up the Zach Bushisms, but shoes do literally take us away from that. And you know, he was talking about in Chernobyl how the animals have survived, but the humans with their sort of insulated souls couldn't survive. And, you know, he talks a lot about how it's almost like a Faraday cage when you're barefoot on the earth, and that electrical connection to the earth, and the way the body moves and works completely different. The inflammation systems in the body are dramatically different, etc., etc. So, look, you know, there's no magic in Vivo at all. There's no technology really. It's quite the opposite. You know, 10,000 years ago, humans made shoes person by person, foot by foot, from local sustainable materials that were in a perfectly circular way. And 10,000 years later, there is no other choice but to completely reimagine an existing system back to an ancient one, a deeply connected to nature one, that just respects humans being part of life and not separate from it. And so I think Vivo is just trying to, you know, do things like our grannies did it a long time ago, you know, like so many other areas of society.
I think one of the things that's really powerful in Vivo, but also just more generally, and I think what brought me personally to the environmental movement was the connection between like personal well-being and health and environmental health. And I was like a super superficial teenager, and not that I'm not superficial now, but very superficial then, and that being able to start to understand and build it from that space of realizing that my health was completely dependent on the health of the environment. And it seems silly to say, but I don't feel like that is being communicated enough, like in environmental rhetoric and in galvanizing people. And I think we are invested in our own health and well-being. We all want to be breathing clean air and drinking clean water, and I think the more that we can start to explore the interrelationship between the two, the hopefully more we can be galvanizing. And Galahad, you mentioned like some shoe companies trying to make the practices more sustainable, and you kind of said that actually it's good to kind of go back to the beginning and the philosophy at the start. And it made me think about another question that I wanted to ask, which is, when it comes to climate narratives or environmental narratives, what is the relationship, perhaps Farhana, you could speak to this, between narratives around dismantling systems and the narratives around co-creating alternative systems that perhaps could make those old systems obsolete? Because I hear most of the mainstream narratives being very focused on dismantling, which I don't feel is that inspiring. I think it can be galvanizing, but and get people involved in a short term, but in the long term, I believe it's quite hard to sustain yourself when you're just focused on that dismantling. So we'd love, but it's also essential. So we'd love for you to speak to that relationship.
Sure. Thank you. So I guess everyone is doing a bit of both, always, actually. It's just the sort of balance and the dismantling that is in the shape of campaigning or through our political system or through policy is, typically called insider work, and is the insider dismantling that's going on. And I guess the movement building, the new culture, the dismantling internally of the old behaviours, seeing, systemic injustices in the first place that you may not have seen, is something that has got to be done all at the same time. We can't do one or the other. Sometimes there's a big tension and a set of choices about what you decide to devote your time to. Like for me, after sort of 25 years, I did have complete exhaustion and burnout, and I felt I couldn't carry on saying, another COP and another treaty and another new law and maybe a bit of litigation is going to save us. So for me, putting my body on the line, really reconnecting with nature, really connecting with the newer movements, including XR, which was one of them, which said, the inner work, the work that you're on as an individual in your own journey was really important. The spiritual work, the grounding work, the place-based work, the community-based work. And actually, ironically, it didn't do as much of that because it was constantly doing the political work. That was the big tension, actually. It's like, no, we don't want to do another action. We all want to sit down and have an assembly together and co-create that. I guess the other big insight is, and I want to say is, none of this work can really happen unless everyone who needs to be in the room is in the room. You can't have a different conversation if it's the same people having the conversation. So more and more of my time is around, Jedi principle. I'm trying to start this whole thing of climate Jedis, which is basically justice, equality, diversity and inclusion is at the heart of our principles. They're the defining core of how we start, and it may take a long time to get those principles established. They're constantly being negotiated and renegotiated, and there are always tensions about how to apply them. But that's the real work. That's the real work, and that's the work that again speaks to assemblies, places like this for discussion, and real proper dialogue about how we co-create the new future based absolutely 100% of the legacies, recognising the legacies and the toxicities of our past as they manifest themselves in us and in our systems. So that is for me the magical, joyous task ahead of us, and that's what I think, Primal Gathering and many other gatherings are really important for, and maybe having, as much diversity as possible to do that is really needed, and that everyone is working at a different pace and at a different time, starting with different positions. They start in different positions and starting points. And in the end, it's very liberating, there's a bit of what Zach Bush said, which was very liberating for all of us. None of us choose the bodies that we're born in. I don't know if that's what he said, but, I maybe the self-organising part of me was existing before. I don't know. I didn't understand that bit. But I think I didn't choose to be born as a woman. I had no choice in that. And I didn't choose to be born in Pakistan. I didn't choose to be born to a family of farmers who then came to this country. I came here when I was 9 years old. No, neither were you born, by choice into the bodies that you are. So if you're born into a body that is predominantly identified as white, that's not your problem and full. But recognizing that gives you certain access, certain privileges, and it carries a certain history, that is part of the understanding that we all need to come to. And that's where I feel that there's a huge space opens up for dialogue and for co-creating really something. And then I'm going to pass it to Kay, because this whole thing of co-creating, really imagining and really thinking, being, feeling our way in a different world, I think that's where the creative arts, the theatre makers, the poets, the writers, musicians are really, really key. And maybe one of the problems, I feel I came to, and now the last 5 years, spent a lot of time, is the more technocratic look at, all issues, from the lens of energy emissions or agriculture as a sector or transport as a sector, as opposed to what about the creative heritage arts sector? What about this? as a solution maker, as a place where we come together and make solutions. So maybe that's why we've worked quite a lot together in many different spaces, because these are really powerful tools for us to use to co-create that world.
Okay, would you speak to that, the kind of relationship between creativity and story?
Yeah, I would just say that I think even thinking in terms of sectors and our differences is a bit of a problem as well. Even though culture declares emergency was a recognition of culture and the arts as being an industry and a sector, but fundamentally culture is a way of being, and the arts and creativity can inspire that way of being. And I don't think the arts are limited to that, or that's just the arts their limitation of what they're solely here to do. But yeah, I mean, even theatre for me is an example of where it's still a boundaried space with a boundaried kind of audience, and I'm always asking the question: who's this for? Who's coming? Who has access? Who can afford it? Who's interested in this? And so I'm actually much more excited by the work, in part, that I have been doing with Farhana and others, which is where we've been bringing song and story and letters and meditation and ceremony to the insider world of where people are really thrashing out policy, or really doing the hard work of changing those systems. And because I don't think we can do it in any divided way. That is where co-creation for me lies. I'm really very privileged to have that kind of access, but I do feel like we need to, in whatever way we have access to, whatever places we have access to be those weavers, to take the stories into other places, to take the gifts of Primal Gathering and take them on, elsewhere. COPs aren't just meant to be for COPs. We're meant to COP stands for Conference of the Parties, right? I'm interested in conferences of the people, and we should be all having those assemblies and those conversations wherever we are, not rely upon gatherings that we have to pay for or turn up to start co-creating. So just to offer that out there.
Thank you. We'd love to open up to the audience, in case the audience would want to ask any questions to any of the panelists. And also maybe just to share any reflections on the power of story, or the stories that have galvanised you perhaps into action.
I'd love to, yeah. I think one of the most powerful stories that we've ever had, one of the most powerful and damaging stories that we've ever had is the story of divide and rule. And I think that it's the division, which is the main issue, which is kind of continuing our difficulties as we go through what you call this transition time, and which Zach was always also alluding to as a transition time, and whether you think that as being, on what level you consider that to be a transition, is up to, what's going on for you. But I think all of us, whether we were involved in Extinction Rebellion in some way or not, so many people have gone through it, and that we have to, and then now there are so many different iterations, so people have gone into their different areas that have been inspired by the IPCC report, by the rebellion and the declarations that we've had. And I think we're all coming from the same place, and I know that a lot of us, having maybe gone through that rebellion and then had all sorts of reasons why we wanted to leave or to do other things, might be desperate for peace. And so a lot of us are kind of maybe now not wanting to, we're searching for what's our new role, how are we going to do it? But I think what we have to trust in is that there is this underlying, undergrowing, movement, this thing that we're all feeling, which is what Zach was really, really referring to, I think, is this kind of, this awareness that there is something very, very different happening, that this is a really, really unique time. And so I think we have to find our commonalities, and be aware that there's this grassroots movement that's bubbling up, and maybe we have to allow people, not to be judgmental of the time that people are taking to find what their gift is and how they're going to come to the fore.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share or to ask a question? Yeah? Good, Ashley.
Quite reach out there. It's not that one. If I move you.
This is probably quite a hard question. What do you think it's going to take for us to act in time to stop runaway climate change?
Are we not already in runaway climate change? I know, Farhana.
I would just take off time references and act now. And every moment is precious, every life saved, every ecosystem saved is precious. And building the fabric and fibre of a more compassionate, kinder world, we will never run out of time for that. It's always here, it's always in our grasps to start that today, tomorrow, yesterday. So I think that's such a different way of looking at it. And that's, again, one of the narratives that somehow we're only doing this in a preventative way. And if we can't prevent it, it's not worth it, or I'm too, it's too depressing, I'm going to go off and do something else. I'm not saying that to you, but that's a very common narrative that is given, that it's already too late, let's give up, or let's double down on, trying to just then, do tokenistic efforts to help. And I don't think that, and I think that the countries and vulnerable groups and my own identity is very much part of be in the present and move forward with what you can, and in the Islamic traditions, which I come from, in the Judaic traditions that I married into, actually, it's, every life saved is, by saving one life, you're saving the human race, is essentially the common principle. And so that's what we act on. Also the coalition of people who are, I do believe we're in this epochal moment change, actually the paradigm change. If I do believe that, I don't know whether everything will shift, and when historians in the future will look back and say, oh yeah, it was in 2000 or it was in 2025 or something. I don't know. No one knows that. That's not what happens. We now look back and say Galileo saying that the Earth wasn't in the centre of the solar system, but the sun was. But at the time nobody knew that, for hundreds of years, that was the epochal moment. So I do think that there is something very magical. I feel the indigenous leaders, the people who are at the forefronts of movements all around the world. I mean, XR is just one small example. There are hundreds of older, more, rooted movements all around the world, that the names of which we don't always know and share, that they are all pointing to this moment as being a moment of coming together, and that actually climate, ironically, is not that's the most important issue, it's just the unifying issue that helps us see all of those connections in our everyday life, also in our past, and how we can move forward together. So for me, it's just kind of random that I'm working in this particular area that is a unifying way of looking at things going forward. And I think that my final sort of comment quickly, I guess we're also running out of time and we need to have dinner, is that there is something really important about speaking to unifying narratives and absolutely not being diverted by divide and rule, and concepts like separation, trauma, understanding that everyone is has differences, but also understanding that there are real economic, financial, climate differences in the world already, and that's the bit that I feel gets a bit lost in some of the lost in translation in some of the conversations that I have. So I think that is really important to know, that we're not all in the same boat. Like some people don't have a boat, and some people will not be saved by the boats coming in. If you know what I'm saying, it's not the same. The impacts are just too differentiated right now. And finally, on boats, you're seeing in the UK, I can't help saying this, tying up the issue of climate justice with migrants' justice is absolutely critical. What is happening is just genocidal in its intensity and its magnitude. Of hundreds of millions of people are being, are forced to move internally within countries and across borders, and you can disguise it whatever you like, you can call people whatever they like. People don't stay put to die or their families to die, they move. That is our human history, that is our DNA, and that is what is happening right now, and it's, you know, putting in place a very ferocious system which is trying to divide and rule us. And that's what I think did happen in 2016. 2016 is when Brexit happened and Trump happened. So yeah, there's a little part of me that also believes in, you know, the divine, you know, mysteries unfolding. And here you got, you know, all around the Western world predominantly, you had very reactionary forces take over and try and basically smash all the forces of progressiveness that were happening. And I do think that we are winning, because they are really spooked, and we are going to win. And hold them to account for all those who did not, basically, who stopped action from happening. I mean, that's me as a lawyer, and that's what happened after the Nuremberg trials, you know, with the Nazis. I'm sorry, there was a genocide that happened, and some people were more held to account and had to be held to account than others, and we will do that. We will do that, and we will get them for ecocide, and we will get them for all of the obfuscation and all of the delays, which is causing misery around the world already. That is the demand for justice that's coming.
Thank you. Well, I don't want to hold you from dinner. Nicole.
I was actually going to see if I could ask a question.
Oh, yeah.
If
Seeing as you've organised.
and dinner started anyway at 7, so it's kind of on anyone's autonomy if they want to leave and give us the full hour that was allotted. So not to compromise on that. Should I just ask? Okay, I can just ask it. So you talked, like, to Kate's point about you know, creating journeys that can remember the exact phrasing, but you know that we should come together in full force and move towards being the change that we need in order to kind of hold accountable and really push for the necessary change that we need. I've got a question basically for all three of you, obviously with deep reverence and respect for your individual paths. This question around this is my personal feeling towards a kind of crisis of commitment. And you know, obviously in your individual lives, you've committed to a journey, and commitment requires, you know, the persistence and perseverance through obstacle, through challenge, through pain, for, you know, this greater, like, North Star to work towards. And I know a lot of individuals also in this room have that same, that same compass, so to speak. Maybe each of you might, if you're open to taking a moment to answer, how can we support this kind of shift more towards a commitment to creating more spaces and places of cooperation and coming together to move forwards in supporting the necessary actions that are needed to kind of take place in order to minimize the damage that we are creating. And maybe there's something from your own journey of your own commitment or choices to be committed that we could all maybe learn from.
Galahad, would you like to go?
Sure. My world, and you know, I'm not qualified to talk on many things like the carbon debate, but in my world of, let's say, business and creating organisations that are trying to support wellness in society and nature connection in many ways, the challenge of commitment, I think, and I see this a lot, is companies purpose-driven companies that have wonderful missions that get to a certain scale and invariably end up succumbing to impatient capital or selling to corporations or whatever. And so society loses literally thousands of really brilliant companies that have purposes and are there to sort of really make a great difference to you know, the system and the way the world's set up in terms of capital just being sort of shoved on them and then into hamster wheels of impatient quick returns, as it were. So the crisis of commitment is really profound in my world, and I see it all around me, even especially in the B Corp community with thousands of companies around the world. So it's a real, and I think it's an imperative that we get more companies scaling independently with long-term views. We talk a lot about that challenge, and we gather in different ways and try and put those groups together and those communities together to sort of hold hands and keep those communities alive of businesses that are genuinely scaling but staying independent and staying long term. And obviously things like Patagonia would be a unique example in my world of a company that scaled and stayed independent and stayed activist and has done a tremendous amount of positivity with their influence. So yeah, it's massively a crisis of commitment and challenge, and I mean it's a whole can of worms on why that is and the way the system's set up, but we've got to break it and help companies scale, and it starts from financial systems to just helping people sort of rediscover a sense of higher purpose to be able to turn down the big checks, basically.
Can I just quickly jump in there? Do you think it's also, I feel like a lot of the most committed brands are still being run by the founders, and like because it's their imagination, that their vision. I'm just trying to think of like an example of a really like progressive established brand that the founder is no longer the
Body shop.
yeah.
But that's
Body-
not a good example.
Yeah.
It's a
Not
bad
a good
example.
I'm
Exactly.
saying of one that the founder left and went down the tank. But
Yeah, well, there's lots of those.
Yeah.
But, I mean, there are examples, I think, of like Riverford has just done effectively brought employee ownership to and there's a lot of, but John Lewis is in the press at the moment a lot about potentially losing its employee ownership type structure and trust. But there's not enough examples.
Yeah.
There are a couple, but there's not enough, and we need many, many, many more. And it's a
I
big
feel
thing.
like the reason why I wanted to bring that up was also to point to like the importance of the radical imagination. I think in commitment, like, I think it's really hard to be committed to something when it's just about mitigating things all the time or making it a little bit better. But when it's like about a radical vision and bringing people on a journey and going like wanting to face the challenges, I feel like that's something to get behind.
Well, I think this is where basically solutions and creating the kind of economy we want to live in is really where I'm at and want to focus on. So it's not just about, ameliorating and reducing the impact of the harm. It's about actually living in an economic system that I really like. And I think a large part of that is pioneering and testing in startups and small and medium enterprises that are locally rooted, that are based on equitable principles, that are trying to do the right thing. So in a way, the giant corporations and transnational, the global supply chains that go with it are probably what made us get to this point of globalization and human connectedness, but they probably need to be broken down and dismantled. They do, not the small companies that actually were the original startups and pioneers in this way. So there's a sort of resetting of the scale issue, and the unaccountability of those corporations is largely what's led to huge damage and this depersonalized economy, and needs to be taken away. And I guess just as a quick final thing for me, I pivoted my life and divided it into sort of threes. So instead of focusing entirely on the COPs, the UN summits, the Conference of the Parties, I say community is the new COP, and I will spend a third of my time at the UN summits, essentially a third of my time in community, in places like this, and trying to organise and help make my high street different, engage really in whether it's my parish or my local authority, really engage in a local rooted place, like be part of that soil. And the third is really in a creative, co-creating, imaginative, bringing all of the different talents of the world together to find our way out of it. So for me, that sort of formula of a third works. Instead of trying to, because it also allows me to then be place space, and not to be always in a policy sort of framework and always in my head, but to really grapple with problems and deal with managing the human relationships and the negotiations that happens, you know, when you try and change something concretely, which is kind of what happens, you know, when you just deal with think tanks and policy frameworks. They're often too far divorced. So yeah, that's one way of taking forward and constantly reviving your commitment is and sort of pinging back and forth between them as to what gives you most joy, because at some time maybe a big campaign to, you know, like Ecocide may take over your life, but at other times creating something like this, you know, would be a really lovely way to also spend time and energy in community. And then finally my energy is going on shifting philanthropy and finding the resources for you guys to all do what you are doing, and the next generation of people to take over so I can retire.
Yeah, just honouring all that you've both done and the changes that you've made, you know, in your business and your professional life, Farhana, and knowing that that takes courage and I think like deep imagining. And the space that is required for that deep imagining is real. Like what you're talking about when making a commitment to something is actually creating space first and foremost to fill into what is the change of my life that needs to happen. Like what am I rededicating myself to, or what new dedication, what new commitment, and it takes time. Like we need time. So yeah, on a personal level, give yourselves time to first of all just pause, just stop what you're doing and stop your normal ways or normal track and look after yourself. What do you need? And probably the answers will come from that place. And what's needed more in a larger picture. But to commit to oneself to those new pathways takes time, it takes courage, and it takes space to re-maneuver your life and community to actually have it mirrored back to you and to be accountable to it and to have the support systems for it, so you can't do it alone too. The commitments are never solo.
Thank you. Farhana, what you just said about being able to make more accessible the resources needed, loop back to Ash's question as well before, like what would it take? And I really think like that word of like access, like how do we make accessible the skills, the networks and the funds needed for people to turn their radical imaginations of like thriving cultures into reality. And I think I've recently gotten really frustrated by, even though we've called this panel about narratives, but like the obsession with story and with narrative, because I actually think there's so many millions of people on the planet who are just like ready to be so deeply involved, but they don't have the resources or they don't have those skills. Like the narrative that created the idea for my sister and I to build Earth was during lockdown, when there was this narrative of humans or the virus. And it was so disturbing because it's the systems which need dismantling, but for millennia and still today, humans have lived not just in harmony in some like passive way, but in active, like being regenerative forces in their environments. Like in the Rainforest Survival International found these very, very fertile areas, and it showed that they realised it was where indigenous communities had been practicing agriculture. And then I was comparing that with like the narrative of get farmers off the land and just rewild it all because humans don't know how to grow food regeneratively. And it was just such a stark contrast, and made us think, you know, what if access to this is really what's important, and rather than feeling like no one cares or no one's committed, or, you know, I feel like it was so much closer to being able to be united in positive action and nature-centered solutions, and it can often feel in the mainstream narratives. Would anyone like to share anything before we wrap up?
Well, I think we're really, dismantling philanthropy, which is what I'm doing, is that's at the heart actually of getting rid of the toxic systems that have built up huge amounts of wealth, and getting therefore the people who are holders of that wealth is absolutely critical. And in the old days, you know, like hundreds of years ago, we would have had a revolution and, you know, guillotined them or exiled them maybe. We don't want to do that because we've also learned that violence, you know, is not the way in which we want to go forward. So sometimes I feel there's huge amounts of frustration, but love and understanding and dialogue and persuasion and the insider track are the route, actually, way forward. And I think, you know, having sessions like this and, you know, those people who are really frustrated with why the hell should we go to another UN summit, well, don't go, but, you know, persuade and support those who are going and understand that they're going into the lion's den and trying to do that work of persuading and cajoling, nudging, also shaming, naming, shaming, and holding accountable through law, through other means, is absolutely sacred work. Now, we're all doing that. We're all holding each other doing that. So that's what I really want to, that's why I'm here, you know, to connect with you, to get that energy, to get that blessing, get that support, and really have each other's backs. No matter where we are in the system, we are changing it. And as long as we see each other, it's almost like seeing a little landscape of ourselves, like where are we in terms of the system change, you know, Christabel is here, Galahad is here doing the corporate stuff, you know, Kay's doing the creative stuff. We're all doing a lot of magical stuff. So yeah, please carry on doing that, and, you know, let's stay connected and in touch, and talk more over dinner. That's what I would like to say.
Thank you, thank you everyone so much for sharing, and for everyone for listening, and to the amazing organisers for creating Primal Gathering for us all to enjoy.